If you've been on the internet, you know that Disney recently announced a whole slew of upcoming movies and TV shows at their D23 Expo. And it didn't take long for people to notice a pattern with many of the titles revealed. The overwhelming majority of the movies and TV shows announced at D23 were sequels, remakes, or tied to existing IPs. In this video, I want to dive into Disney's animated films and answer one question. How did this happen?
How did this happen? We're smarter than this.
Apparently not.
How did we get to a point where Disney Animation Studios and Pixar are not only working on more sequels than original films, they're barely producing any original films at all? Are we all just blinded by nostalgia? Have they always released sequels at this rate? Or has something truly shifted at the Walt Disney Company, causing them to prioritize sequels above everything else? Well, to answer that question, we have to go back to the late 80s, specifically 1989. In November of 1989, Disney released The Little Mermaid, a film that upon its initial release in North America made $84 million, or $212 million adjusted for inflation. The Little Mermaid was significant in the fact that it marked the beginning of what would later be known as the Disney Renaissance. You probably already know what the Disney Renaissance is, but just in case you don't or you need a refresher, it consists of Disney's animated films released from the years 1989 to 1999. It was during this decade that Disney casually dropped masterpiece after masterpiece like it was nothing. The Lion King, Beauty and the Beast, Hercules, Tarzan, Mulan, Aladdin. Not only were most of the films released during this era massively successful critically, they also turned Disney into a box office juggernaut. But it wasn't until the commercial success of 1992's Aladdin that the gears in the mouse's head truly started turning. The Walt Disney Company had already been trying to find ways to capitalize on the success of their Renaissance films. They had released a Little Mermaid TV series and had plans for an Aladdin TV series before the film was even released. But when they saw how successful Aladdin was, they decided to turn the pilot into its very own movie and release it to home video under the title Aladdin: The Return of Jafar. It should be mentioned that Disney's CEO at the time, Michael Eisner, was apprehensive to the idea, feeling that there was a possibility it could cheapen Disney's brand. Haha, boy was he wrong. Anyway, the higher-ups at Disney were eventually convinced and released the non-theatrical sequel. It made more than $100 million in the United States on a budget of $3.5 million. Following the massive success that was the second Aladdin, Disney released yet another Aladdin sequel, Aladdin: King of Thieves, which once again proved how lucrative direct-to-home video sequels could be for Disney. After the release of Aladdin 3, I think it's safe to say that any apprehension Disney had towards making low-budget sequels to their beloved films was gone. Throughout the rest of the 90s and into the 2000s, nearly every single Disney Renaissance film received its own low-budget sequel. Beauty and the Beast, Pocahontas, The Lion King, The Little Mermaid, you name it, chances are it got a sequel.
Ursula's crazy sister!
Even films outside the Disney Renaissance started getting sequels. Cinderella, 101 Dalmatians, and even Bambi for some reason. Well, that settles it then. Disney's shift towards sequels was way back in the 90s, and their recent tendency to greenlight sequels is actually nothing new, right? Well, yes and no. While it is true that Disney released a ton of sequels in the late 90s and early 2000s, arguably more than they do nowadays, it was clear that their original theatrical releases took precedence. Until they didn't. Yeah, remember when good old Mike said he was worried that Disney's shift to cheaper and easier to produce sequels could cheapen Disney's brand? Well, he was right. Despite having an amazing streak of critical and box office successes in the 90s, Disney's animated films in the early 2000s were just not doing nearly as well in terms of box office success. But you know what animation studio was seeing tons of critical and commercial success? That's right, Pixar. While Disney had been focusing on low-budget sequels to the detriment of their brand and the quality of their original films, Pixar was focusing on releasing high-quality films based on original concepts, And while they had admittedly made a sequel, that being Toy Story 2, Pixar managed to sidestep many of the pitfalls Disney sequels had fallen into by not sacrificing the sequel's quality and giving it a proper theatrical release. By the time 2006 rolled around, Pixar was kind of killing it. So what did the mouse do in response? It bought them. Of course it did. One major shift that was a result of Disney's acquisition of Pixar was the fact that John Lasseter, a former Disney animator, director, and executive producer at Pixar, was made the chief creative officer for both Pixar and Walt Disney Feature Animation. I won't go into the full story of John Lasseter in this video. All I will say is that he is a controversial figure in the history of Pixar and no longer works for them or Disney. The reason I bring him up is because he was largely responsible for Disney's shift away from direct-to-DVD sequels. When he became Disney's chief creative officer, he canceled several of them, including The Aristocats 2, Meet the Robinsons 2, and a low-quality Tinkerbell film. Oh, and they also canceled Chicken Little 2. No! Obviously, that was the right call. Disney's low-budget sequels to 2D movies already didn't look great. I can't even begin to imagine how horrific Chicken Little 2 would have looked. Like, this was Disney working with a $150 million budget, and they wanted to make another one with a lower budget? How? By 2008, Disney released their last direct-to-DVD sequel, Ariel's Beginning. And things were starting to look up for them. For a brief moment, it seemed like both Disney and Pixar were actually on the same page. Pixar was still dropping bangers every year, and Disney, no longer devoting so much of their resources to low-budget films, was actually able to give its theatrical releases the time and the attention they deserved. But it couldn't last. Pixar, now with more than a decade of incredibly high-quality original films, and sequels for that matter, had a dud on their hands. Cars 2 was panned by both critics and audiences alike, to the point it is often regarded as Pixar's worst film, the first major mark on their previously unstained legacy. Or at least it would have been if it hadn't made a frick ton of money. Let's be honest, that's all that really mattered to the higher-ups at Disney and Pixar. With Cars 2 being so successful financially, it didn't take long for Disney to greenlight a ton of other Pixar sequels. Now, to be fair, the rate at which these sequels released was a lot more reasonable when compared to Disney's shenanigans in the early 2000s. But it was clear that Pixar's philosophy surrounding the type of movies they make was changing. Maybe it was Disney influencing them, maybe it was Pixar themselves. Either way, Pixar would still make original movies, but every few years we'd get a Monsters University or a Finding Dory. Honestly, I feel like this wasn't a bad compromise. An odd sequel here and there would allow Pixar to still make original films while also having the financial safety net that sequels provide. Plus, these sequels would be full-blown theatrical releases, meaning that they would theoretically be much more high quality than Disney's sequels of the 90s and 2000s. Similar to Disney in the 90s, Pixar kinda went nuts with the sequels. Following the immensely successful Incredibles 2, Disney Animation Studios also decided to throw their hat back into the sequel ring after a decade of much-needed abstinence from it. And what film did they decide to make their grand return to sequel making with? What a comeback! Okay, I know that some people watching this video might feel like I'm hating on Disney sequels just for the sake of hating on them. And fair enough, I have been ragging on them a lot. But I do want to say that I actually don't mind an occasional sequel. In fact, there are a lot of Disney sequels that I really love. Toy Story 2, 3, and 4, Inside Out 2, Shrek 2. Okay, I know that that last one isn't Disney, but you better believe I'm taking every chance I can get to sing the praises of that movie.
And you know what? I'm not afraid to admit I like Frozen 2's music. It has Weezer.
I say all of this because I truly believe that when done correctly, sequels can be great for both movie studios and their respective audiences. But as we've seen by looking at Disney's history over the last few decades, there comes a point when sequels stop being exciting and start to feel like egregious cash grabs. As of right now, Disney has several sequels slated for release within the next couple of years. While I want to continue to be optimistic about these films, I will admit that the sheer quantity of sequels on Disney's docket and the rate at which they are scheduled to release is starting to look eerily similar to the direct-to-home video era of yesteryear. I recognize that I'm just some guy on the internet and I know nothing about running a multi-billion-dollar company, but in my personal opinion, the Walt Disney Company would be far better off if it focused less on sequels and more on original films. Yeah, sure, releasing a ton of sequels might be good for them in the short term, but mark my words, if they continue down this path of unoriginality, it will hurt them in the long run, just like it did during the early 2000s. I think this classic saying sums it up best. Those who do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it.